My country, right or wrong? That phrase has an interesting history. To understand, let's go back to 1815, when America achieved victory in the Second Barbary War with the help of naval officer Stephen Decatur. In 1816, Decatur attended a celebration of his victory, where he gave an after-dinner toast which would go down in history, recounted in an 1846 biography like this: "Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong." Now let's fast forward to 1872. Carl Schurz is a German immigrant who came to America, fought with the Union in the Civil War, and became a Republican senator. At the time, France and Germany were at war with each other, and so France, our ally, asked if we could supply them with weapons. Carl Schurz, the German immigrant, opposed this, causing other senators to attack him, accusing him of being unpatriotic, secretly loyal to the Germans. A couple ad hominems later, and Senator Schurz was forced to defend his stance on the Senate floor. And because an opponent of his had invoked that famous "my country, right or wrong," Senator Schurz provided a rebuttal to the quote. "The senator from Wisconsin cannot frighten me by exclaiming, 'My country, right or wrong.' In one sense, I say so too. My country, and my country is the great American Republic. My country, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right." One biography of Schurz said that the applause in the galleries was deafening. Today, I am here to go through history and examine how varying types of patriotism have affected our politics. And I argue that we need to be the generation to reevaluate patriotism, to not define it as a belief in American superiority or as contentment with our nation as it is, but to define it as the determination to improve our country, to align ourselves with the best of the American ideals. And that includes acknowledging dissent as a form of patriotism. As Dan Rather says in his book, What Unites Us, while nationalism is rooted in arrogance, patriotism is rooted in humility. In essence, we need less of Stephen Decatur's right or wrong patriotism and more of Carl Schurz, if wrong, to be set right patriotism. To start, nowhere in history is the paradox of a certain contextual appeal to patriotism more visible than in slavery. One of America's founding ideals is equality amongst men, an idea with which slavery is very clearly incompatible. And yet, pro-slavery arguments certainly used a lot of patriotic appeals. How did that work? Well, the obvious number one answer is blatant racism, but another factor was an assumption by the people that they embodied their creed. What I mean by that is the belief that America as it was completely lived up to all of the ideals on which it was established, and thus was innately good. An objection to an institution as American as slavery was seen as an objection to America itself, and consequently, to the American ideals. For an example, let's go to 1858. Stephen Douglas, a supporter of slavery, is running against Abraham Lincoln, an opponent of slavery who you've probably heard of, for a seat in the Illinois Senate. The two of them engaged in a series of debates across Illinois, and this is an excerpt in which Stephen Douglas responds to Lincoln's argument that a house divided cannot stand, or free states and slave states cannot coexist. Douglas responds, "Why cannot this country endure, divided into free and slave states as our fathers made it? They have existed and prospered from that day to this, thus divided. Why can we not thus continue to prosper?" Stephen Douglas confused patriotism with an evil form of traditionalism, which willfully ignored the tragic paradox between a free nation and a nation of slavery. Content with conceived prosperity, at least to his own group, and a belief that America at the time completely lived up to the ideals which it was established, Douglas believed that change signified something un-American, and that dissent was unpatriotic. Now, again, in the civil rights era, so-called patriots decried those who fought for civil rights as unpatriotic, for they threatened the previous imbalance of the United States. But today we should realize that those who fought for a better country were the greatest brand of patriot, and dissent is patriotic. Now, during the Cold War and the Second Red Scare, patriotism was used as a defense to persecute anybody who opposed strident American efforts against communism. In the early 1950s, Joseph McCarthy compiled a list of government officials whom he suspected were communists. This ended up not being the case, but before Senator McCarthy was finally tried, anyone who stood up to his methods was subject to accusations of attempting to undermine America. The great journalist and broadcaster Edward R. Murrow boldly criticized McCarthy, and in 1954, he put eloquently the essence of the situation. It is necessary to investigate before legislating, but the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made the same assertion in his argument against the Vietnam War. Now, of course, one of the difficulties in speaking out today grows out of the fact that there are those who are seeking to equate dissent with disloyalty. It's a dark day in our nation when high-level authorities will seek to use every method to silence dissent. Dissent is not disloyalty. And if dissent is aimed at improving our country, dissent is patriotic. Now, let's move into the current century. America's response to the terror attacks of 9/11 were a mosaic of the best and worst parts of patriotism. On a human level, as citizens came together, most of them were at their best, because in the spirit of unity, they found the spirit of patriotism, a force which erased barriers as they found common ground in recovery and in honoring heroes who responded to the attacks. However, with the attacks came an anger, a justified anger, but an anger all too hostile and prone to misdirection. Patriotism was used as an excuse for some very non-democratic acts which opposed our ideals, such as the ironically named Patriot Act. The Iraq War ended up being a misguided and deadly conflict. In the name of defending our country, we betrayed our ideals. And that was not patriotism, that was fear. But that was the fear that has created the world which we have grown up in. A lot of us are not old enough to remember the 9/11 attacks, but we have grown up experiencing their consequences. I was inspired to speak on this topic around October of last year because of something I began noticing in our political discourse. Specifically, it was a tax reform debate on CNN between Senators Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz. At one point, in his typical statistics-citing fashion, Bernie Sanders compared America to European countries. Now, without getting into the actual economic debate, I want to examine the rhetoric which Ted Cruz uses when he responds. Your answer is, let's make us like European socialism. I say, let's make us like American exceptionalism, free enterprise and opportunity for everybody. Now, American exceptionalism is an idea with some merits, but it shouldn't be construed to signify an innate American superiority to other countries, especially if statistics can argue otherwise. And that founding ideal of America being a land of opportunity is a great one, but it's one that we need to fight to assure. Here we see that assumption that America embodies its creed, that just because it's an idea which we believe, it is automatically true. When really we need to fight to assure that this ideal of opportunism is actually true before we condemn borrowing from other nations on account of America being exceptional. But if we do want to redefine patriotism this way, what do we do? Well, earlier this year in my US history class, we were discussing youth culture, and a buddy of mine said to me something to the effect of, I think this generation is way less patriotic. And although we may be coming from different places, there are aspects of that sentiment which I agree with. I know that there are many people our age who are incredibly politically involved, but I know that there are also a lot of us who too quickly fall into apathy or hopeless inaction, or are afraid of using our voices to stand up about issues which we care about. But if we redefine patriotism in this way, we will have no shame in recognizing and solving our issues. We will find that spirit of patriotism in those who fight for this country's people, be it by service, be it by dissent, lead by participation in democracy. But aside from these wider cultural and sentimental shifts, what specifically can a person do? Well, simply become engaged. Talk to friends or engage in discussions and debates about ideas which interest you. Most of us are not old enough to vote yet, but once you're 18, make sure you register and show up to elections. And if you're 16 or 17, you can actually pre-register to vote. It becomes valid once you turn 18, and you can do it all online. And finally, learn the names of your senators and representatives. If you live here in Gilroy, your representative is probably either Zoe Loughran or Jimmy Panetta, and it's very simple to look up. And on their websites, they have links to contact them by email or calling. I personally keep a list of all of my friends' representatives so that if a bill which I support is introduced, or if I'm opposed to an issue which I believe legislation could help resolve, I'll tell my friends about the issue and send them the links to their representatives, along with an idea of what they could write. But you don't have to annoy your friends like I do. It's also good to just have that email and be ready to use it when you want to express support or dissent about certain legislation or issues. And it doesn't have to be a huge paragraph either. You guys can just write a sentence. I support this bill. So let's not be distracted by the symbolism which tends to engulf dialogues about patriotism. But instead, let's become that generation which recognizes patriotism as a desire to improve, to align ourselves with the best of the American ideals. As a senator said in 1872, "My country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right."